One of my goals for tonight and for us is that we elevate the story of religious liberty in Culpeper and the significance of Culpeper to the story of religious liberty in our nation and in our world. A couple of weeks ago, we had a couple of pastors at our church from Pakistan and Ukraine and kind of celebrate some work we've been doing with them. And it was just a unique experience to take them over to the site of the jail. There are a lot of great things in Culpeper, but we all need to be able to articulate the history of religious liberty and why this community is so central to that. So that's one goal. The other goal with Andrew here and with Trevor here is we need to get Heaven Hill Distillery to do something that makes Elijah Craig Bourbon to do something with us here in Culpeper. How they have not marketed this as the preacher's whiskey, I do not know. That just seems like an obvious thing. So I hope we'll do a little bit about that tonight. The story of Elijah Craig, a Baptist and a bourbon maker, is a story that could not be told today, could not be created today. There's not a lot of Baptist preachers that are also bourbon makers. That doesn't really work. So it's a unique story in our history. Baptists were very small part of the population pre-Revolutionary War. No real significance. And then the Great Awakening happened, and Baptists grew and grew and grew. So to give you some perspective, in the 1760s, they were throwing Baptist preachers in jail. In the 1780s, Baptists had so much influence in Virginia that we could influence James Madison to include religious liberty in the First Amendment. So just imagine the growth that was caused by the Great Awakening. And in that growth, the divisions that sometimes Baptists have been known for through our history were there pretty quickly as it grew. And there were separatist Baptists and there were regular Baptists. The separatist Baptists were more revivalistic, more evangelistic fervor, preaching, and they went with the we have no creed but the Bible. That was that group of Baptists. Regular Baptists typically had a confession of faith, and if you're know anything about Baptists, that's still kind of an argument. Do we have no creed but the Bible, or do we have a confession of faith? So that was a part of it in Elijah Craig's day. David Thomas was a regular Baptist. Samuel Harris was a separatist. But they were holding meetings over in Orange County, and while they were doing that, Elijah Craig was convicted and became a believer in Christ. And right after that, he would let his tobacco barn be used daily for revival meetings, for prayer meetings for some time. And, so again, it's that Great Awakening fervor that's happening. What's interesting is Nathaniel Saunders, who is the first pastor of Culpeper Baptist Church, before that was the first pastor of a church that Craig and his brothers were a part of in Orange County. And so we have that connection as well. The Craigs, you have Elijah Craig and his two brothers. Elijah Craig was imprisoned in Fredericksburg. He was imprisoned in Orange, and he was one of the 11, let me see if I can get there, one of the 11 Baptist preachers imprisoned here in Culpeper. Culpeper is the hot spot, okay? And the oral history of our church is that we built a church on the site of the jail at East and Davis Street, right up the street from here. So 11 Baptist preachers are imprisoned for preaching without a license, and you know that story. The Anglican Church is the established church of that time, and they said if you're going to preach, you got to go through us. You have to have permission from the established church. And these separatist Baptists, these revivalistic Baptists, these evangelistic fervor Baptists said, no way. We don't need your permission. We have permission from God. And so the Anglican Church threw them in jail. Culpeper, their conditions were harsh, and the persecution in Culpeper was pretty intense. And so Elijah Craig is one of those that are imprisoned here in Culpeper. Because of his connection to Orange, we also know that, or pretty much think that he had opportunity to influence James Madison. We usually tell that story through John Leland, who was the second pastor of Culpeper Baptist Church, that John Leland was the leading Baptist of that day, certainly. And we have a historical record of him meeting with James Madison. But we also think Elijah Craig's story was part of that experience there. During the Revolutionary War, and if you've paid any attention to John Regasta, one of the things Regasta says is that Baptists used the Revolutionary War to gain religious liberty, that they said, we're not going to go fight in the Revolution if we can't get religious liberty. And so McClanahan, who's on that list, William McClanahan, is one of our Baptists who was one of the Culpeper Minutemen. Elijah Craig served as a chaplain in the Revolutionary War during that time. He moves to Kentucky, and Andrew's going to cover a little bit of this. Part of the traveling church, his brothers go first, and he trails behind a couple of years later. And just know that Elijah Craig and most of these folks are kind of rebel rousers. They wouldn't make it as the pastor of Culpeper Baptist Church today, right? I mean, you got to be professional and educate and all those kind of things. But when he was in Kentucky, the Elkhorn Baptist Association, we have a record of this question coming up at the associational meeting: whether it is agreeable to Scripture for churches to suffer men to preach and have care of them as their minister that are trading and entangling themselves with the affairs of this life. That question is solely focused on Elijah Craig. What do we do with this Baptist preacher who's also not just making bourbon, but he's an entrepreneurial businessman? And they didn't quite know how to work that out. How did the sacredness of what he did go along with the way he was involved in the business part of the world? And Elijah Craig had this really wrong notion. He didn't think pastors should be paid. And I don't know where he got that, and I'm so glad we grew out of that. But, and again, just know that none of these people would recognize what I do as being part of their stream. These were folks who were not educated, certainly weren't professional, didn't get to pastor churches that have huge real estate assets in the center of town. They were on the fringe of everything they experienced, and they went at it with great passion. Elijah Craig in Kentucky, again, if you know anything about Baptists, you might know that occasionally we divide, we split, we argue. And he was certainly at the forefront of that. He had a significant issue with another Baptist pastor in Kentucky, Joseph Redding. Elijah Craig was excluded from church for a time in Kentucky. He had quite a temper, and they would say that when he could kind of curtail his temper and do what God was leading him to do, he was tremendous. When he didn't, he kind of took it out on others. I would close my part with Elijah Craig and these Baptists were amazing pioneers, right? They created things, Elijah Craig especially, that entrepreneurial spirit. When Culpeper Baptist has been at our best, it's when we're pioneering, when we're risking, when we're trying different things. I'm not suggesting we're going to start making bourbon, but when we're doing different things. And Elijah Craig, that attitude, that spirit that he had, needs to come back to our faith communities. You know the story of Culpeper Baptist. We started a retirement community. We started a child development center. We've pioneered a lot of things in this community. And I like to think when we do that, we are honoring the legacy of Elijah Craig. All right, hold on. That's the lock and key. I always need to show that. The lock and key from the Culpeper Jail, which is on at the Virginia Baptist Historical Society at the University of Richmond. But Culpeper Baptist Church believes we own that, but we're going to let them keep borrowing it. All right, Andrew's coming.
Okay, I'm really worried after that. I can't beat you, Dan, but thank you. That was amazing. So I'm here because Elijah Craig's sister is my fifth great-grandmother. And this is something I've known for a couple of years, but I really didn't understand the Craig family and their role in Virginia and Kentucky history until I was asked to do this lecture, and I did my research, and I found an amazing story, which I'm going to share with you tonight. So, Tolliver Craig. Why Tolliver Craig? Tolliver Craig is the posthumous child of John Craig, who died in Scotland in 1704. This John Craig was great-grandson of John Craig I, who was born in 1512, died in 1600. This is from a Craig family history in 1927. There is dispute of who Tolliver Craig's parents were. He was either Tolliver Craig, his father was either Tolliver Craig Sr. or John Craig. And this is one of these things that only DNA would solve, but one parent died in Scotland. He came, the other parent died soon after, and he was raised in Spotsylvania in the Tolliver family. Quickly, John Craig I, thought to be his ancestor, was one of the great reformers in the Scottish church. He's very well known. There's a lot written about him. So this religious fervor and reformist passion came down in his DNA a long way. And I would note that John Craig Sr.'s father was killed at the Battle of Flodden in 1513. Was the father of John Spotswood, a name you will recognize. So those families have a long history together. So why Tolliver? Well, Robert Taliaferro, or as we say in Virginia, Tolliver the immigrant, was born in 1627. He came to Virginia around 1647. He is my 8th great-grandfather. And he was a progenitor of the Tolliver family, which became for 200 years one of the most powerful families in Virginia from the 1600s to the Civil War. Very wealthy planter family. Tolliver Craig was raised within that family. And we have Tollivers here. On the left is Lawrence Tolliver, who is the first commanding officer of the Culpeper Minutemen. And his grandson is Dr. Alexander Tolliver. His grave is at Madison Mills. He married first Jane Walker, whose first cousin was Robert Stringfield Walker, who founded Woodbury Forest. His second wife is Kitty Madison, the niece of President James Madison. Comes down to my family. I have a daughter. Her name is Juliana Tolliver Katofsky. So we've carried the name for 400 years on in our family. So Robert Tolliver married Mary Hawkins. Mary Hawkins' family is well known. Together they had 11 children, 7 sons and 5 daughters. This is from Family Search, and you can see all of them. 3 sons became Baptist ministers, John, Lewis, and Elijah. My ancestor, Joyce or Rejoice Craig, was the second after John. Tolliver Craig was the 3rd son. So Tolliver Craig Sr., and I'm going to read this because it helps me too. Anyway, there were early convicts of the Baptist church. Actually, again, you've learned his sons were preaching. Tolliver Craig actually founded the first Baptist church between the Rappahannock and the James River, the Upper Spotsylvania Baptist Church. And then after the Revolution, Craig brought his church together and en masse immigrated to Kentucky. It's called the Traveling Church. It was one of the great stories in American pioneer history. I think this is lost to Virginia history because they left and out of sight, out of mind. But for Kentucky history, this is a really important event. 400 people gave up their possessions and moved en masse, the single largest movement in Virginia history, into the Kentucky regions. And if you read about the Traveling Church, it is just an amazing event. And they go on into Kentucky and settle near Lexington in 1781. This is an interesting document. I'll read it to you. I'm sorry. So this, before he left, the Craigs were very prosperous, very good businessmen, very entrepreneurial. This is actually a agreement in 1781 between Butler Spotswood, the widow of Governor Alexander Spotswood, and the lease of 150 acres in St. Mark's Parish to Tolliver Craig for John Craig and Lewis Craig, his sons, for life. And they're going to plant 3 good fruit trees and apple trees and put a fence around them. So interesting that how these families sort of come together. An example of the business they were doing before they left. A really important event takes place in Kentucky, the siege of Byron Station. The Craigs have traveled en masse to Kentucky. They settle in a settlement called Byron Station, a wooden fortified settlement. And in the fall of September of 1782, they are attacked by a group of 300 Indians and British loyalists. They get advance word that they're going to be attacked. They retreat inside the stockade, but they realize they have no water. And in the morning, it's decided that the women would leave the stockade as they did every morning and go out and fetch water so they could feed the fighters and put out fires from the fire arrows. And so all the women of the stockade left knowing they were surrounded by Indians and liable to be slaughtered, went to the well and got water. And this is an event in Kentucky history about the women that went to the water. And this is the DAR memorial there at the event from August 1896. And on it are the list of the women that went to fetch water. On there are 15 Craig women, and you can't read it, but Daniel Boone's niece is also listed there. And I'll just say, an important event happened after this. A few days after this, the Indians lifted the siege because they heard that there was a rescue force coming, which included Daniel Boone. The force got to Byron Station. It was decided that the men would race after the Indians and try to defeat them. The Indians set an ambush, and the colonial forces were soundly defeated. And the Battle of Blue Licks was the last victory of British forces during the Revolutionary War. Daniel Boone barely escaped. Unfortunately, one of Daniel Boone's sons was killed in that attack. But the Siege of Byron Station and the Battle of Blue Licks are linked as two of the last events in the Revolution. So I come down from Rejoice or Joyce Craig, his sister. I don't know if you can see. Is this something? Yes. So here we go. Here's Tolliver Craig. This is my ancestor, Joyce Craig, married John Falconer in Orange County. They have a child, John Falconer Jr., who marries Margaret Morrison, and their child marries my third great grandfather, John Rhodes, and in Orange County. So that's my link to the Craigs. The Craigs, the movement to of the Baptists from Orange into the Kentucky county was not all at once. It was over a period of time. My ancestor went in 1779. John Craig, Tolliver Craig's eldest son, had gone exploring, finding settlements for them. My ancestors went in 1779, and actually Elijah Craig went in 1786, I believe. This is a book that's published on Amazon, which includes interviews from my ancestor on what it was like to be a pioneer in Kentucky. Elijah Craig. Elijah Craig married Frances Smith. They had 14 children, all of which were born in Spotsylvania. Well, some were born in Virginia, some were born in Kentucky. Elijah Craig's first pastorate is Blue Run Baptist Church. This is how it looks today in Barboursville. In 1769, it was his first formal preaching position. In when was it? 1786, like his father, the entire congregation picks up and moves to Kentucky. It becomes a black congregate church, which it remains today. So Elijah Craig then settles outside of what is now Lexington, Kentucky. He he purchases the land. It's named Lebanon, and it's renamed 1790 to Georgetown after George Washington. Elijah Craig, as was said, incredibly entrepreneurial, but very interested in education. He established the first classical school in Kentucky in 1787, a year after he got there. The school was linked to the Rittenhouse Academy, which he founded in 1798, and it was the forerunner of Georgetown College, which is still active today in Lexington. So he also established Kentucky's first fulling mill for cloth manufacturing, his first paper mill, his first rope walk, his first lumber and grist mills, and a ferry across Kentucky. I wonder how this guy had any time to preach. He was just, it was incredible. And he also played a major role in forming Georgetown's first fire department and served as a fire chief. In 1789, he built his distillery in what was Fayette County. The location later became Woodford in 1789, and then Scott. It was never Bourbon County. As it happened, both Fayette County and Bourbon County were named in honor of General Lafayette. Lafayette is, of course, from the House of Bourbon, or Bourbon, and Lafayette's surname is really Fayette. It's Lafayette, so that's where that comes from. This is an interesting quote from a biography of Virginia Baptist ministers from 1859. Elijah Craig was considered to be the greatest preacher of the three brothers in a very large association, Virginia. He was among the most popular of a number of years, and I like this part. His preaching was of the most solemn style, his appearance of a man who had just come from the dead, of a delicate habit, a thin visage, large eyes and mouth, his sweet melody of his voice, both in preaching and singing, bore all down before it. His voice extended like the sound of a great trumpet. The great fervor of his preaching commonly brought many to tears from his hearers, and many, no doubt, were turned to the Lord by his preaching. That does a great description of him. But this is interesting. This is from his obituary from the Kentucky Gazette. He possessed a mind extremely active, and as his whole property was expended in attempts to carry his plans to execution, he consequently died poor. If virtue consists of being useful to our fellow citizens, and perhaps there were none more virtuous men than Mr. Craig. Anyway, thank you.
All right, a couple of tough acts to follow here. But I'm going to kind of just talk about the history of whiskey and bourbon in America. And you kind of can't really tell that story without talking a little bit about rum. So before whiskey, rum was the prominent spirit in the 18th century. And starting in the late 17th century, rum production was big industry in the New England states, as sugarcane and molasses required to make rum were being imported from the British West Indies. And other than the obvious ways in which we might enjoy rum today, socializing, entertaining, ceremonies, etc., it was also used for medicinal purposes and as a currency, and even common for craftsmen to drink while they were working. So I think we probably wouldn't be surprised then to learn that colonists were consuming about 3.7 gallons of rum annually per head by the time of the American Revolution. George Washington was said to be very fond of it, especially after having spent his only trip abroad for a couple months in Barbados as a young man. And after losing his first attempt to win the Frederick County, Virginia seat in the House of Burgesses, he won a second attempt after serving 40 gallons of rum, as well as plenty of beer, wine, cider, and brandy to voters, which was common practice at the time. He also served it to his soldiers. He provided a rum ration for his slaves, and he ordered a special barrel of rum to be imported from Barbados for his 1789 presidential inauguration. So there's a lot of complex history related to the sugar and molasses trade between the colonies and England and France. But in a nutshell, I think the decline began or was accelerated when England imposed a series of acts aimed at increasing revenue and creating a monopoly on the import of sugar and molasses that was being used in the production of rum. The Molasses Act of 1733 sought to create a monopoly by prohibiting the purchase of sugar and molasses that was being used for rum by any foreign country other than England. And the Molasses Act was not well enforced or obeyed, so it was later more strongly enforced and followed by the Sugar Act of 1764, which greatly increased the tax on molasses, sugar, but also other goods like wine, coffee, and textiles. So these were largely responsible for a big increase in the smuggling of rum, molasses, and sugar, and it put many Americans outside the law and increased the price of rum, molasses, and sugar. So the Sugar Act was followed soon after by the Stamp and the Townshend Acts, but the Sugar Act was first specifically aimed at raising colonial money for the crown and spawned some of the first protests of taxation without representation in the colonies. And we've all heard of the Boston Tea Party, of course, but the lesser-known Gaspee Affair of 1772 preceded it by over a year. The HMS Gaspee, here in these two paintings down here, was a Royal Navy ship that ran aground in Narragansett Bay in Rhode Island while it was chasing a colonial ship that it suspected of smuggling French rum and molasses. And after it ran aground, colonists attacked it, boarded it, and burned it. And so this was among the first acts of violent uprising against the Crown authority in British North America, and it's considered one of the first of many events which brought us closer to our war for independence. So giving rise to whiskey here, whiskey was not new to the world or to the colonies in the late 18th century, but as rum production declined, whiskey production increased. And unlike rum, which was made from molasses and sugar, whiskey is made from distilling fermented grain. It was used very similarly for enjoyment, medicines, and currency, but it was also an economically advantageous alternative to rum because those grains could be grown here in America on American soil without having the cost and complexity of the imported ingredients. And in the 1700s, roughly 250,000 Irish and Scottish immigrants brought their tradition of whiskey distillation to the New World. And as I'm sure many of you know, they moved into all parts of Appalachia, including Kentucky through the Cumberland Gap. And they primarily used barley in Ireland and Scotland at the time as the base for whiskey, and they still do. But at that time, barley didn't really grow well in America, so those early whiskeys were really rye-based, and to some extent corn, but mostly rye. So corn kind of brings us to bourbon. All bourbons are whiskey, but not all whiskeys are bourbon. In fact, most whiskeys aren't bourbon, especially when you leave the United States. But at the turn of the 20th century, we started seeing laws regulating how whiskey must be made before it could be labeled a bourbon. There just were few, if any, laws prior to that in the 18th and 19th centuries regulating that kind of thing. And as far as we know, the name bourbon didn't really become widely used until the mid-19th century. But corn production was increasing in early America as settlers moved west into the Ohio River Valley and beyond after the Louisiana Purchase. And that corn belt today, it's interesting, still supplies more than 1/3 of the world's corn, more than any other country. But as far as we know, Elijah Craig was not a drinker. Can you confirm that? I don't know. Sure. But that's what I've read. But corn was plentiful, and he was a businessman. Whiskey made from corn was just more profitable than the corn itself due to the labor and skill required and the higher demand that it just fetched a higher price. But it was also there were other more practical things too, it was more perishable than in its liquid form, and it was easier to transport whiskey in the liquid form, than in its natural state, so it was easier to get more product to market. So if my math's correct, the whiskey weighed about half that of the corn that would have been required to make the whiskey, and the corn took up about 3 times more space in a wagon or a boat. So it really just made sense. And boats are significant here too, because after Alaska, Kentucky has more miles of navigable water than any other state in the Union. And shipping by boat became even more common after the Louisiana Purchase, where they could really start shipping farther west, north, south, and eventually exporting to other countries through the Gulf. So, what is bourbon? The origin of the name bourbon is really unknown. Some think it's named for Bourbon County, Kentucky. Some think it's named for Bourbon Street in New Orleans as a marketing tool to appeal to the people of New Orleans, which was the largest market for bourbon at that time. But we just don't know for sure. We know that the county and the street in New Orleans were both named in honor of the Marquis de Lafayette of the French Royal House of Bourbon, as Andrew mentioned a little while ago. And that modern definition of bourbon is more strictly regulated now than it was in the 18th century. So contrary to popular belief, bourbon does not have to be made in Bourbon County. It doesn't even have to be made in Kentucky. It really just only needs to be made in the United States. And 2 of our local distilleries here, Belmont Farms and Copper Fox, both have bourbons. And you don't have to go too far outside this area to find other distilleries that make bourbon as well. It has to be all grains, as with all whiskey. It's got to be all grains, so no potatoes or juniper berries or agave or anything like that. It's all got to be grain. And that grain bill has to be at least 51% corn. It's got to be distilled to a maximum of 160 proof, barreled at a maximum of 120 proof, and bottled between 80 and 150 proof. And there can absolutely be no added colors or flavors, and it must be aged in new charred oak barrels, which really brings us to Elijah Craig. He's often credited with inventing bourbon. He certainly didn't invent corn whiskey, and he didn't invent storing alcohol in charred barrels. We know the French were storing cognac in charred oak barrels at least as far back as the 15th century. But some believe he may have been the first to store corn whiskey in charred oak barrels, which is really what gives bourbon its the color and flavor that we expect from a modern bourbon. And some claim he stumbled upon this by accident due to a fire at the distillery, and some say that he and other distillers were doing this to get rid of the off flavors that were caused by other product having been stored in those barrels previously, like weird things like pickles and fish and stuff like that would have given the whiskey a really off flavor. And those things seem plausible, but we just don't know. They're possible but unsubstantiated. So in 1874, there was a book called The History of Kentucky by Lewis Collins. It was published 66 years after Elijah Craig died, and it kind of indirectly implied that he had been the first, because it claims that the first bourbon was distilled in the fulling mill in Georgetown, Kentucky. And as we learned from Andrew's presentation, he founded Georgetown, Kentucky, and he built and owned that fulling mill. So it seems like logical to assume that maybe he was the first one to have created that or distilled that bourbon there. But there's no source provided for that claim. And Elijah Craig himself never claimed to have invented bourbon, and no one around him ever claimed that he invented bourbon. So we really just don't know. And it seems possible also that his name just kind of survived above all those other early distillers for all the other interesting and great things that he did in his life. But regardless of whether he invented bourbon or not, I think his name certainly deserves to survive and be respected as a true early pioneer of Kentucky bourbon distilling. And Heaven Hill Distillery, founded in 1935, I think they also believe that, which is why they purchased the right to use the name in 1976. And they first started selling bourbon under that name in 1986. We have no way of knowing whether the modern bourbon, tastes anything like what the man himself created. It probably doesn't. I think the procedures are probably very different, and we have no idea, I think, what that recipe was, how much corn was in it, did it have did it have wheat or barley or rye or all of those things or some combination of them? We have no idea, so it's unlikely that it really resembles Elijah Craig's bourbon, but it is really great. We know that, and the modern brand is like very successful. The small batch and their toasted rye are kind of their like flagship, especially the small batch, and that's like very available. You can get it at just about every bar in town I've checked. But they're ultra premium whiskeys. They're the barrel proof and the single barrel 18-year. I've had the barrel proof. I love it. I've never tried the single barrel. I'd really like to try it sometime. But they're kind of hard to get your hands on. But they've won a lot of awards, and they're really great bourbons. But I think the bottom line is just that regardless of whether he invented it or not, the name is well revered in the industry and deservedly so. And I think Pastor Down's going to come around with some samples. Yeah, that's it.